Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and it's time to keep Series 9 and Week 73 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Last week, we began letter 214, which quickly went from, that isn't a bug, it's a feature, to, let me tell you everything I ever thought about Hobbit birthdays. Today, we learn more about the Hobbit tradition of gifts before moving on to more on Hobbit families themselves. Now, while relatives closer than second cousins were expected to give, again, so long as they lived within that 12-mile range, close friends, even if they lived right next door, were not, although they certainly could give. Now, as for this 12-mile range, there's a reason for this, and it has to do with the delivery of these gifts, and I'll let Tolkien explain. The Shire residence limit was obviously a fairly recent result of the gradual breakup of kinship communities and families and dispersal of relatives under long-settled conditions. For the received birthday presents, no doubt as a relic of the customs of small ancient families, must be delivered in person, properly on the eve of the day, and at latest before nuncheon on the day. Now, I have to say personally, I rather appreciate the very clear rules as to what's appropriate and what's expected from whom. But there's also more on this specificity as well, as Tolkien adds that the gifts were to be received in private by the celebrant. In fact, Tolkien writes, "It was very improper to exhibit them separately or as a collection, precisely to avoid such embarrassments as may occur in our wedding exhibitions, which would have horrified the Shire-folk." I love that. This is wonderful. There is no being embarrassed by your rich uncle one-upping your nice gift. And this aside into wedding gift etiquette continues in a footnote, too, because birthdays just aren't enough for the professor. No presents were given at or during the celebration of Hobbit weddings, except flowers. Weddings were mostly in spring or early summer. Now, that certainly would allow for attending a lot more weddings. Also, Tolkien adds, assistance in furnishing a home, if the couple were to have a separate one, or private apartments in a smile, was given long before by the parents on either side. So, no gift registry, no aunts saying, "I know you registered for this set of dishes, but we got you this entirely different set because we like it better." And no, that was actually hypothetical. My aunts are amazing. Anyway, wedding gift etiquette aside completed, let's return to Tolkien explaining why gifts were to be received in private with no exhibits. The giver could thus accommodate his gift to his purse and his affections without incurring public comment or offending, if anyone, any other than the recipient. That's a relief. And better still, but custom did not demand costly presents, and a hobbit was more readily flattered and delighted by an unexpectedly good or desirable present than offended by a customary token of family goodwill. Then, Tolkien ties this all back into the issue originally addressed by Mr. Nunn, the question of gifts and Smeagol. He writes, "A trace of this can be seen in the account of Smeagol and Deagol, modified by the individual characters of these rather miserable specimens. Deagol, evidently a relative, as no doubt all the members of the small community were, had already given his customary present to Smeagol, although they probably set out on their expedition very early in the morning. Being a mean little soul, he grudged it. Smeagol, being meaner and greedier, tried to use the birthday as an excuse for an act of tyranny. 'Because I wants it,' was his frank statement of his chief claim. But he also implied that Deagol's gift was a poor and insufficient token. Hence Deagol's retort that, on the contrary, it was more than he could afford." Now, frankly, Tolkien could have stopped here. He's already gone far deeper than Mr. Nunn's letter required, but he continues because that's just how Tolkien goes. And now he goes into the giving of gifts by the birding, the hobbit whose birthday it is. He explains that gift giving by the birthday hobbit is personal and a form of thanks, that it varied much more in form in different times and places, and according to the age and status of the birding. And before we get into those variations, I want to point out that Tolkien adds, this leaves out of account the gifts to parents that we talked about last week. Now, ordinarily, I would overlook that and keep going, but there's a footnote to that line that's worth reading. In more primitive communities, as those still living in clan smiles, the birding also made a gift to the head of the family. There is no mention of Smeagol's presence. I imagine, Tolkien writes, that he was an orphan, and do not suppose that he gave any present on his birthday, save grudgingly the tribute to his grandmother. Fish, probably. One of the reasons maybe for the expedition. It would have been just like Smeagol to give fish actually caught by Deagle. Indeed, it would have been just like him. So back to this notion of gift-giving based on the age and status of the birding. Tolkien writes that the master and mistress of a house or hole in the Shire would give gifts to all under their roof or in their service, and usually also to near neighbors. And they might extend the list as they pleased, remembering any special favors in the past year. It was understood that the giving of presents was not fixed by rule, though the withholding of a usual gift, as for example to a child, a servant, or a next-door neighbor, was taken as a rebuke and mark of severe displeasure. Juniors and inmates, those having no house of their own, were under no such obligations as rested on householders, but they usually gave presents according to their means or affections. And by the way, a quick note on the word inmate here. He's not talking about people in prison. The meaning that Tolkien is using here is the original one for the word. It's a late 16th century term denoting a person who shared a house, specifically a lodger or subtenant. So, what about the party in gift giving? Not very expensive as a rule, applied to all the gifts. Bilbo was in this, as in other ways, an exceptional person, Tolkien writes, and his party was a riot of generosity, even for a wealthy hobbit. But one of the commonest birthday ceremonies was the giving of a party in the evening of the day. All those invited were given presents by the host and expected them as part of the entertainment, if secondary to the fare provided. But they did not bring presents with them. Shire-folk would have thought that very improper. If the guests had not already given a gift, being one of those required to do so by kinship, it was too late. For other guests, it was a thing not done. It looked like paying for the party or matching the party gift and was most embarrassing. Sometimes, in the case of a very dear friend unable to come to a party because of distance or other causes, a token invitation would be sent with a present. In that case, the present was always something to eat or drink, purporting to be a sample of the party fare. Now, after laying out all of this incredible detail, Tolkien argues that the details he recorded in the published story do actually fit into a definite picture of sentiment and custom, though this picture is not sketched even in the incomplete fashion of this note. I mean, sure, he says, I could have put it in the prologue, but, quote, that prologue is still too long and overloaded, according even to those critics who allow that it has some use, and do not, as some, advise readers to forget it or skip it. And let me be very clear, I never recommend forgetting or skipping the prologue. Finally, and I'll end on this note for today, incomplete as it is, this note may seem to you much too long, and though you asked for it, more than you asked for. But I do not see how I could have answered your queries more shortly in a way suitable to the compliment you pay me by taking an interest in hobbits sufficient to mark the lacuna in the information provided. He's a lot more generous than I would be, I think. For now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week when Tolkien says that the giving of information always opens still further vistas. Vistas we'll visit together. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You can also support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. And please, join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Podcast listeners, please subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps. For those of you on YouTube, subscribe to this channel to get all of the PPP productions, including eventually all 9 seasons of the PPP, both seasons of Rings of Power Wrap-Up, all the episodes of the TTT, and my new streaming project, The PPP Plays. And be sure that you're following @PrancingPonyPod on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and simply The Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.